She was 18 years old, she had done nothing wrong, and they were going to sell her anyway. Black Hollow had seen cruelty before, and drought, fire, men shot dead in the street over a card game. But nothing like this. The auction platform stood in the center of town like a wound that wouldn't close, and every soul watching from the boardwalks knew the truth they refused to say out loud. The men who built that platform owned everything worth owning in 3 territories, and anyone who opened their mouth would find themselves standing on it next. The crowd stayed quiet. The bidding was about to begin. Press like and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has come. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The platform had been built from old barnwood, rough, splintered, still smelling faintly of hay and rot. It had gone up 2 days earlier, which meant they had planned this for at least that long. Eliza Thorne noticed the detail the moment they marched her out of the jailhouse and into the morning heat, her wrists bound with rope that had already rubbed the skin raw. Nobody built a platform in 2 days unless they were certain of the outcome. Whoever had ordered this had never considered that anything might go differently. That thought, more than anything, was what made her stomach clench. Black Hollow stretched out around the platform in every direction. A single main street with a saloon at one end and the sheriff's office at the other, framed on both sides by weatherboard storefronts and hitching posts and the kind of dust that never fully settled. It was a town that looked permanent from a distance and temporary up close, like a man who kept his boots on because he was ready to leave at any moment. Eliza had grown up outside it. She knew every face in the crowd pressing toward the platform now, and none of them met her eyes. That was the thing that surprised her most. Not the rope, not the auctioneer in his sweat-stained vest already shuffling his papers at the front edge of the boards. Not even Dale Cutter standing off to the side with his thumbs in his belt and that particular expression he wore when something was going exactly the way he intended. What surprised her was the faces of people she had known her whole life, people who had eaten at her father's table, who had borrowed tools from the ranch and brought back pies at harvest time, and every single one of them was looking somewhere else, at the ground, at the sky, at the middle distance where nothing at all was happening. She had known, in an abstract way, that no one was going to help her. She had understood it intellectually from the moment the debt collectors showed up at the ranch with their forged papers and their hired muscle. But there is a difference between understanding a thing and seeing it standing right in front of you in the form of 30 people who will not look you in the eye. Eliza straightened her back. If they wouldn't look, she would make them. She walked up the steps to the platform without being pushed, which seemed to unsettle the man holding her arm. She stood at the center of the boards and looked out at the crowd and did not look down once. Her dress was dirty, her hair had come half out of its braid. There was a cut above her left eyebrow from when one of the debt collectors had grabbed her too roughly in the jailhouse doorway, and the blood had dried in a thin dark line that she hadn't been able to wipe away. She stood there anyway. She let them see all of it. The auctioneer, a man she knew only as Whitaker, who handled similar business for Cutter's operation in 2 other towns besides this one, cleared his throat and began his preamble. The usual language. Outstanding debts against the estate of the late Marcus Thorne. Assets including livestock, equipment, and the labor obligations of the surviving heir, assessed at market value, to be sold in satisfaction of creditors. Legal words arranged to sound like law when they were nothing of the kind. Eliza's father had not owed those debts. She knew it. The men who had drawn up the papers knew it. Everyone in this crowd who had done business with Marcus Thorne for 20 years knew it too, because Marcus Thorne had been one of those rare frontier men who paid what he owed before he paid anything else and who never once signed a note he wasn't certain he could honor. The debts were fabricated. The papers were forged. The men who had put her on this platform had done it because her father's land sat on top of 3 freshwater springs and beside the only year-round creek within 40 miles. And that land was worth a great deal of money to someone who intended to control the water supply to every ranch and farm in the valley below. She had tried to explain this to the sheriff. He had looked at the papers and told her they appeared to be in order. She had tried to explain it to Harlan Bishop, who ran the land office and had known her father personally for 15 years. He had told her there was nothing he could do. She had tried to explain it to Rosamond Foley, who owned the boarding house and was the closest thing Black Hollow had to a community conscience. Rosamond had pressed her lips together and looked out her front window at the street and said, very quietly, "You should leave town, girl." while you still can. She hadn't left, partly because she had nowhere to go, partly because leaving felt like agreeing that what was happening to her was something she deserved, and partly, though she would not have admitted this out loud, because she was not yet willing to accept that this was simply the way things were. Now she stood on the platform, and the auctioneer was calling for opening bids, and she was beginning to understand what accepting it felt like. It felt like standing very still in the center of something loud while all the sound drained out of the world around you. Dale Cutter stepped a little closer to the platform. He was a large man, well-fed, wearing a coat that cost more than most of the men in this crowd earned in a month. He had the kind of face that arranged itself naturally into expressions of authority. Not threatening exactly, just certain, the face of a man who had never once worried about whether a thing would go his way. He had not bothered to hire a representative to bid on his behalf. He intended to do it himself, in public, in front of everyone, because the public nature of it was part of the point. 500, Cutter said. The crowd was silent. Whitaker looked out over the assembled faces and invited additional bids in his professional auctioneer's voice, the one that implied the whole procedure was simply commerce, simply the ordinary mechanism of debt satisfaction, simply business being conducted in the expected fashion. No one spoke. Eliza looked at the faces she had grown up with. Tom Abernethy, who had helped her father mend fence 2 summers ago, was studying his own boots with tremendous concentration. Agnes Pruitt, who had taught Eliza to read and had been at her mother's funeral, had her eyes fixed on something behind and above the platform, high up where the mountains began their slow blue rise from the valley floor. Will Draper, who was young enough that he might not yet have fully understood what he was watching, was looking at his hands. Going once, Whitaker said. Eliza did not close her eyes. She would not give them that. Going twice? The sound came from the western edge of town, out past the last buildings, out where the road dissolved into open range, and the dust that preceded a rider often arrived well before the rider himself. It was not a dramatic sound. It was simply the sound of hoofbeats, measured, unhurried, moving at a pace that suggested the rider was choosing his pace rather than being governed by urgency. But something about it cut through the crowd noise with the precision of a blade. People turned. They couldn't help it. Whatever instinct existed in frontier people that told them when something was about to change, that same instinct that made horses raise their heads before a storm arrived, fired in the crowd all at once. The murmuring stopped. The shifting and coughing and boot scraping stopped. Everyone turned west. He rode out of the dust like a man who had arranged it that way. Eliza would think about that later, say, the way the timing worked, the way the light was angled, the way the horse moved with that particular deliberate unhaste. She would wonder whether it was calculation or coincidence, and she would never fully settle the question. But in the moment, watching him come, she felt something that she recognized reluctantly as the first breath she had taken in 2 days that went all the way down. The horse was a big gray animal with a cavalry bearing, the kind of horse that moved because its rider directed it, and not for any reason of its own. The man on it sat easy, not rigid, one hand on the reins and the other resting on his thigh. He wore trail clothes, dark with use, and a hat pulled low against the morning sun. He did not ride fast, and he did not slow down when he hit the edge of the crowd. People moved out of the way. Nobody needed to be told who he was. That was the first thing Eliza noticed. Nobody leaned to a neighbor and asked. The name moved through the crowd in a low wave, half breath and half sound. Mercer. Rhett Mercer drew his horse up 20 feet short of the auction platform and sat there a moment, looking at the setup with an expression of faint and genuine curiosity, like a man who had come across an unusual variety of rock on the trail and was taking a moment to examine it before deciding what to do. Dale Cutter had gone very still. Whitaker, the auctioneer, had let his papers drop a little, though he was clearly struggling to reassemble his professional composure. Mercer swung down from the gray with the ease of a man who had spent most of his adult life getting on and off horses, tied the reins to the nearest hitching post with the same everyday efficiency, and walked toward the platform. He was a big man, not in the way that Cutter was big, not well-fed and self-satisfied, but rangy and deliberate, the kind of build that came from doing hard things for a long time and not stopping. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, weathered in the specific way of men who spent years under open sky, with a scar along the left side of his jaw, and eyes that Eliza, from her elevation on the platform, could now see were the flat, particular gray of a sky before a storm. He stopped at the base of the platform steps. He looked up at Eliza. She looked back at him. "This the Thorn girl?" he said. Not to anyone in particular. "It is," Whitaker said, because someone had to say something. "And we are in the middle of—" "What's the bid at?" Mercer said. Whitaker blinked. $500. Mercer looked at Cutter. Cutter looked back at him with an expression that was doing its best to remain the expression of a man in control of the situation. 501, Mercer said. The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it. "This," Cutter started. "Is that not how it works?" Mercer said. He turned to Whitaker. "That's not how it works?" Yes, Whitaker said faintly. "That is how it works." Cutter's jaw tightened. Eliza watched him calculate. She had never seen anyone do visible arithmetic with their face before, but that was what it looked like. The rapid assessment of risk and benefit, the measurement of what Mercer's presence here meant against the cost of escalating publicly in front of a crowd that was now watching with an entirely different kind of attention than it had been watching before. 600, Cutter said. 601. 700. 701. The crowd had gone so quiet that Eliza could hear the wind moving over the rooftops. Cutter's face had passed through controlled and was heading somewhere else. He was a man who was very rarely defied, and the experience was visibly uncomfortable. $1,000, Cutter said. He said it loudly, clearly, with the finality of a man who expected that to end the conversation. Mercer looked at him for a moment. Then he reached into his coat, produced a billfold, and counted out bills with the unhurried patience of a man sorting mail. 1,200, he said, and handed the money to Whitaker without looking at him. They did not speak on the road out of town. Mercer rode ahead, and Eliza followed on a borrowed mare that he had acquired from the livery without explanation, and the space between them was occupied by the kind of silence that was not comfortable but was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who had just been through something together without agreeing to be in it together, and neither of them knew yet what that meant. The road climbed out of the Black Hollow Basin through scrub oak and cedar, rising toward the higher country where the air was cooler and the dust fewer. After about 3 miles, Mercer turned off the main road onto a track that wound up into the ridge timber, and Eliza followed because she had nowhere else to go, and because, though she was not ready to trust a man she did not know, regardless of what he had just done, standing in the road alone did not seem like an improvement. The track climbed for another mile before the trees thinned and opened onto a wide bench of land with a view back down into the valley. There was a cabin on the bench, solid and low, with a stone chimney and a covered porch and a corral out back where 2 horses and a mule stood in the afternoon shade. A dog lifted its head from the porch steps when they rode up, assessed the situation, and put its head back down. Mercer dismounted, tied his horse, and began unsaddling with the efficiency of long habit. Eliza stayed in the saddle. "I'm not going to ask you to thank me," he said, without looking up from the saddle cinch, "so you don't have to figure out whether you mean it." She stared at the back of his hat. "What do you want?" He got the saddle off, hung it over the corral rail. "I want you to get down off that horse before it decides it's tired of standing still." "That's not what I mean." "I know." He turned around and looked at her directly for the first time since they'd left town. Up close, his face was harder than it had seemed from the platform, with more lines than she had expected, and a steadiness to his expression that was not comfortable exactly, but was not threatening either. "There's coffee inside. If you want to have a conversation, I'd rather have it sitting down." She got down off the horse. The inside of the cabin was austere without being dirty, the kind of space arranged by a man who was rarely in it and preferred to keep it manageable when he was. There was a table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a bunk on one side, and a cot folded against the opposite wall, and shelves along the back wall loaded with an odd mixture of supplies and books. She noticed the books. They were not decorative. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that had clearly been sitting a while and set one in front of the chair he didn't take. She sat. She wrapped her hands around the cup because the altitude had put a chill in the air, and her dress was still the light cotton one she had put on 2 mornings ago when the debt collectors came. "You know who I am," he said. "Not a question." "I know what people say. That's usually worse than the truth, and occasionally better." He drank his coffee. "What do you know about Dale Cutter?" She blinked. She had not expected that to be the first question. "He's been buying up land in the valley for 3 years. He already owns the Harmon place, the Delacroix claim, and the 2 parcels the Beaumont brothers had to sell when their herd went down with tick fever." She paused. The tick fever wasn't natural. Everyone knew it, but no one could prove it. Something shifted slightly in Mercer's expression. Not surprise exactly. More like a man who has been listening to an unfamiliar tune and has just recognized it. "Tell me about the debt papers," he said. "They were filed with the land office 3 weeks ago. They claim my father borrowed money against the ranch from a lending company called Consolidated Western Finance, and that the debt came due and was defaulted." She pressed her lips together for a moment. "Consolidated Western Finance does not exist. It's a name on paper. I looked into it when I had 2 days in the jailhouse to think about things." "How'd you look into it from a jailhouse?" "I asked Rosamond Foley to pull the territorial registration filings for me. She owed my mother a favor she never paid back." Eliza set down her coffee cup. "The company was registered 4 months ago with no listed officers, no physical address, and its only listed agent is a man named Tatum, who also happens to be the legal representative for the Dunmore Land Syndicate." Mercer went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet on the road. He was looking at her steadily over the rim of his cup. "You've been doing this from a jailhouse." "I've been doing this since I realized nobody else was going to." He set down his own cup. He leaned back in the chair, and for a moment the only sound was the wind working at the corners of the cabin and the distant sound of one of the horses shifting in the corral. "The Dunmore Land Syndicate," he said. "You know them." "I know of them. They operate out of 3 territories under 4 different names, depending on what they're doing and who they're doing it to. The Consolidated Western Finance arrangement is one of their cleaner techniques. Establish a fictional creditor, fabricate a loan, file the debt against a property they want, then foreclose before anyone can follow the paper trail back far enough to see what it is." He picked up his coffee cup again, found it empty, and set it back down. "Your father's land is the 14th property they've moved on in this region in 3 years. Eliza stared at him. "You've been tracking them." "Trying to." "For how long?" He was quiet for a moment. "Long enough to know that going after them frontally doesn't work. You need the ledgers, the actual transaction records, the internal ones, not the filed documents. Without those, you've got a theory. With them, you've got a case that a territorial court can't dismiss. And do you have them?" "No." He stood, took both cups to the basin, set them down. Stood at the window looking out at the bench and the tree line below it. "I have pieces. Testimony from 2 ranchers they've already run off who were willing to put their names on paper. An affidavit from a land office clerk in Redding County who noticed irregularities in their filings and kept copies before he was transferred. A bank draft trail that gets close to the Dunmore principles but doesn't get all the way there." He turned from the window. "What I don't have is someone inside Black Hollow itself who can move around without Cutter's people noticing." The air in the cabin had changed. Eliza could feel it, the temperature of the conversation dropping into something more specific. "I'm not a spy," she said. "I'm not asking you to spy on anyone." He pulled the other chair out from the table, turned it backwards, and sat down with his arms crossed over the back. "I'm asking whether you're willing to work. There's no safe version of what I'm trying to do. I won't tell you there is. Cutter already knows I bought your debt, and he's going to want to know why. And his first guess is probably going to be close enough to the truth that it makes things harder from here on." "Then why do it publicly?" she said. "Why not?" "Because Cutter was going to own you in a legal sense, which means he would have had a legal basis to prevent you from going anywhere, or speaking to anyone, or making any claims against his operation for as long as he decided to exercise it." His voice was flat, matter of fact. "Whatever arrangement we work out is better than that, whatever else it is." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the west-facing window now, cutting across the table between them, and she could see the lines in his face clearly. The weathering, the scar, The particular weariness of a man who had been working at something hard for a long time. You said you need the actual ledgers, she said. I do. Cutter's organization keeps two sets of records, the filed documents and what my father used to call the real books. He found out about them from the land office clerk in Black Hollow, the one before Harlan Bishop, right before that man left town in a hurry. She let that sit for a moment. My father wrote everything down. He didn't trust banks, and he didn't trust lawyers, and he kept detailed notes on everything he observed about Cutter's operation going back 2 years before he died. Those notes are hidden at the ranch. Mercer's eyes had sharpened. Where? A place I know, not one they would find without tearing the buildings down. She paused. The ranch is occupied. Cutter put 2 men in there the day after the foreclosure. I know. How do you... She stopped. You've been watching the ranch. I've been watching a lot of things. He stood from the chair. Your father's notes. Can you get to them? Not alone. The word hung in the air between them. He moved to the window again, stood with his hands at his sides, looking out at the drop of the land below. She watched the set of his shoulders, the way he calculated without moving, the way she was beginning to understand constituted thinking for a man who did most of his living outside. There's a room in the back, he said, behind the wood stove. I'll take the cot. That's not an answer. It's all the answer I've got right now. He turned from the window. You need to eat. There's salt pork in the larder and cornmeal. Can you cook? She stared at him. Can I? Yes, I can cook. Good. Because I'm a poor one. She couldn't tell, for a moment, whether this was humor or simply honesty. She suspected it was simply honesty, which she found, against her better judgment, somewhat reassuring. She got up and went to the larder. 3 days passed. They had a shape to them, those days. Not comfortable exactly, but structured, which was something. Mercer was up before first light, out for an hour she didn't ask about, back in time for the coffee she had started making because someone had to. He answered questions with the particular economy of a man who had spent too much time alone to bother with social padding, but he answered them. She had expected stonewalling. What she got instead was information, delivered without ceremony. Names, dates, property records, the slow architecture of the Dunmore Syndicate's operation laid out on the table over 3 mornings in pieces, the way you might lay out parts of something broken to understand how it had worked before it broke. She gave back what she had. Her father's observations, as many as she could recall precisely, organized by date and sorted by what they confirmed versus what they suggested. Mercer listened the way very few people she had known listened, without preparing the next thing he was going to say, without the slight film of inattention that people wore when they were waiting for you to stop talking. He listened as if the information was valuable, and she was the one who had it, and that was simply the arrangement. You said Consolidated Western Finance used a man named Tatum as its registered agent, Mercer said on the second evening. The lamp was lit against the early dark that came with the altitude, and he had a territorial map spread on the table that he had been marking with pencil. That's what the registration showed. Tatum is also the agent for 2 other shell companies in the Dunmore network, Pilgrim Land Associates and the High Valley Water Rights Cooperative. He tapped the map. They incorporated the Water Rights Cooperative 8 months ago, and it hasn't moved on any property yet. That's the next play. They're going to use it to purchase water rights across the whole drainage, and once they control the water, they control every ranch in the valley whether they own the land or not. Eliza leaned over the map. She had never thought of herself as someone who read maps particularly well, but she could see it clearly. The blue marks Mercer had made at every spring and water source, the lines of the creek system, the way the land funnel shaped from high country to the valley floor, and everything that depended on water depended on what happened at the top of that funnel. Her father's land was at the top. That's why they wanted ours first, she said. Your father figured it out. That's why he's dead. The bluntness of it hit her like a physical thing. She had been allowing herself to think of her father's death as illness, the lung sickness that had taken him over 8 months, the decline that the doctor in Black Hollow had ascribed to age and dust. She had suspected for a while that the timing was convenient. She had not, until that moment, heard anyone else say it plainly. You're saying I'm saying the timing fits. I'm saying your father was the one person who had documented evidence of what they were doing and who had the standing to present it to a territorial court, and I'm saying he died before he could." Mercer looked at her across the map, direct and without softening. "I can't prove it. What you need to decide is whether it changes anything for you." She looked down at the map. She looked at the blue marks on the high ground. She looked at the network of lines that spread from her father's land down to everything below it. "It doesn't change what I'm going to do," she said. "I know. I'm telling you anyway because you should know what you're in the middle of." Outside the cabin, the night had fully settled, the kind of high country dark that had depth to it, with more stars than the valley floor ever showed. An owl moved somewhere in the trees below the bench. The dog on the porch shifted and resettled. "There's something else," Eliza said. He waited. "My father had a contact in the Dunmore organization, someone who worked close to Cutter and who was uncomfortable with what they were doing. He never told me the name, but he mentioned in his notes that this person had expressed willingness to confirm certain facts if the right situation arose." She looked up from the map. "I don't know who it is, but if we could find them, it changes the whole shape of it," Mercer said quietly. "Yes." He sat back. He looked at the ceiling of the cabin with the expression of a man doing complex calculations in his head. The lamp moved slightly in a draft from the stovepipe, and the shadows on his face shifted. "The ranch," he said. "We need to go for the notes." "I know. Tomorrow night, there'll be cloud cover." He glanced at her. "Can you ride at night?" "I grew up doing it." "Good." He stood, began folding the map with the careful habit of a man who kept his equipment in order. "Get some sleep." She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the back room on the bunk he had given her, and she listened to the night sounds of the high country, and she thought about her father's hands, which had been large and calloused, and which had worked this land for 20 years, and which had also, in the last year of his life, written down everything he saw in a cramped, careful hand in a notebook hidden in a place she knew and Cutter's men didn't. She thought about the 14 families. She thought about the water rights. She thought about the way the crowd had looked everywhere but at her face. She thought about Rhett Mercer, who had ridden out of a dust storm and paid $1,200 for a stranger's freedom without telling her why, and who had then sat across a table from her for 3 days and treated every word she said as if it mattered. She was not certain what that meant. She was not certain what any of this meant. But in the dark of the back room, with the owl moving in the trees outside, and the dog settling on the porch, and the mountain pressing down around the cabin with all its indifferent weight, she felt something she had not felt since the morning the debt collectors came to her door. She felt like a person who was doing something rather than a person. Things were being done to. It was not a comfortable feeling, but it was hers, and she held on to it. The town of Black Hollow had a way of settling into itself after dark. The saloon kept its noise contained to its own walls. The few dogs that weren't tied up made their rounds of the alleyways, and the respectable houses drew their curtains against whatever happened on the main street after 9 o'clock. The jailhouse had one lamp burning in the front office where the night deputy sat. The sheriff's house was dark. Most things were dark. Harlan Bishop's office in the land registry building was dark too, but there was a man inside it. He was not Harlan Bishop. He was sitting at Bishop's desk with a lantern turned low, working through a stack of files that he had pulled from the locked cabinet, which was not locked when you knew where Bishop kept the secondary key. He was a careful man, which was one of the reasons Dale Cutter trusted him for work like this, and he was going through the files one at a time, looking for anything that Harlan Bishop might have held back from the documents he had officially processed. He almost missed it. It was filed in the wrong folder. Whether deliberately or accidentally, he couldn't tell. A single sheet, handwritten, in a cramped, careful hand that he recognized after a moment as the handwriting of Marcus Thorne. A list of dates, names, and transaction amounts, with annotations in the margin that referenced a ledger number and described, in precise and understated terms, a set of payments made through Consolidated Western Finance to a public official in Black Hollow. The man at the desk went very still. Then he folded the paper carefully, put it inside his coat, returned the files, relocked the cabinet, turned out the lantern, and left through the back. He did not know, walking through the darkness toward the livery where his horse was stabled, that he had just found exactly what Rhett Mercer had been looking for 3 years. He did not know that the girl whose sale he had attended that morning was lying awake on a bunk in the high country, thinking about her father's notes. He did not know that the shape of the next month was already determined, set in motion by things that had happened before he walked into that office, and things that would happen after he walked out of it. He knew only that he was holding something that people on several sides of several lines would very much want to find before the other sides did. In the morning, he thought, he would have to make a decision about what to do with it. In the morning, everything would be different. But that was the morning. Tonight, the town of Black Hollow lay dark and ordinary under a sky full of stars, giving no sign at all of what was already moving beneath its surface, building pressure like water behind a dam, patient and quiet and absolutely certain, in the way of water and time, to break through. They rode out before midnight, when the cloud cover Mercer had predicted moved in from the northwest and swallowed the stars in sections, leaving the valley below them in the kind of dark that made distances unreliable and familiar shapes strange. Eliza rode the borrowed mare and kept pace without being told to. She had grown up moving through this country at night, knew the way the land sounded different after dark, the way you navigated by gradient and tree smell, and the particular quality of wind coming off open ground versus timber. Mercer rode ahead, but not far ahead, and once or twice he glanced back, and she could tell from the angle of his head that he was checking her position rather than her capability. She appreciated the distinction. The ranch sat in a shallow hollow below the ridge road, tucked behind a stand of cottonwoods that her father had planted as a windbreak 30 years ago, and that now stood 30 feet tall, rustling with a sound like moving water whenever the wind was up. As they came down the back slope through the timber, Eliza could see the faint orange line of a lamp through the main house window. One of Cutter's men. The other was probably in the bunkhouse, which sat 40 feet east of the main building with its own small window facing the corral. They tied the horses a quarter-mile back and came in on foot, moving through the cottonwoods. Eliza knew where to put her feet. She had played in these trees as a child and worked around them as a young woman, and the ground beneath them was as familiar as the floor of a room she had lived in. She moved without sound. Behind her, she could hear Mercer moving with somewhat less familiarity, but with a deliberateness that amounted to the same result. He placed each step as if he had thought about it first, and the effect was of a large man taking up very little space. The thing she needed was in the old smokehouse, which sat at the far edge of the outbuildings, separated from the main house by the length of the barn. Her father had built a false bottom into the salting shelf along the back wall. Not an elaborate construction, nothing a carpenter would admire. Just a piece of board fitted over a shallow space he'd dug into the earth beneath the shelf's support post. He had shown it to her when she was 14 and told her it was for emergencies. She had thought at the time it was a strange thing to build, and she had not thought about it again until 2 days ago in the jailhouse. They made it to the smokehouse without trouble. The door was on the north side, away from both the main house window and the bunkhouse, and it was not locked. There was nothing in a smokehouse that warranted a lock, which had been part of her father's reasoning. Inside it smelled of old hickory and salt and something faintly sweet that she could not name and had always been there. She found the shelf by feel, found the post, worked her fingers along the board until she found the edge. "Here," she said, barely above a whisper. Mercer was at the door watching the gap between the buildings, his back to her. He said nothing. The board came up. Her fingers went into the space beneath and found the oilcloth bundle her father had put there. She could feel the shape of it, the hard rectangular edge of the notebook inside, the second bundle beside it that she hadn't known about. She took both. She was tucking them inside her coat when the bunkhouse door opened. The man who came out was not suspicious. He moved like someone making a routine trip to the outhouse, slow and half asleep, his suspenders hanging off his shoulders and his boots unlaced. He went toward the outhouse on the west side of the barn, which meant he passed within 30 feet of the smokehouse door. Eliza did not breathe. Mercer, at the door, had gone so still he might have been part of the wall. The man passed. The outhouse door latched. They were moving again before it opened back up, back through the cottonwoods, back up the slope, not running, but moving with the compressed efficiency of people who understood that the margin was thin and getting thinner. They did not speak until the horses were under them, and the ranch was half a mile behind. "2 bundles, Eliza said. "I saw." I didn't know about the second one. Mercer glanced at her in the darkness. Your father was a careful man. More careful than I knew. They rode back to the bench in silence, and when they got in and lit the lamp and she unwrapped the oilcloth on the table, what she found in the second bundle made the careful man seem almost prescient. The notebook she had expected. 40 pages of her father's cramped handwriting, organized by date, covering 2 years of observations about Cutter's land acquisitions. But the second bundle held something else, a folded set of papers that turned out to be copies of internal Dunmore Syndicate correspondence, 5 letters bearing the signature of a man named Aldous Crane, who was identified in the letterhead as Regional Director of Operations. Mercer picked up the top letter and read it in silence for a long time. Where did he get these? He said. It wasn't a question. I don't know. These are internal, not filed documents, not correspondence with outside parties. These are from inside their operation. He set the letter down and looked at her. Your father had a source inside the Dunmore organization. The contact. The person he had mentioned in his notes, obliquely, without a name. He never told me who, she said. No, but whoever it was took significant risk getting these out. He picked up the next letter and read it. Then the next. By the 4th letter, his expression had shifted into something that was not quite grimness, but was close to it. The expression of a man who has suspected a thing for a long time and is finding it confirmed in more specific terms than he anticipated. What is it? Eliza said. He set the letters down side by side on the table, in order, and turned them so she could read them right side up. Read the 3rd one. She read it. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing, and then it came clear all at once the way things did when the pattern finally resolved. The references to the official arrangement, the monthly amounts, the description of our contact in the county seat who had agreed to ensure that territorial filing reviews would not flag Dunmore's property acquisitions for further examination. They have someone in the territorial land office, she said, above the county level, someone with authority over the review process itself. He tapped the letters. This is why every challenge to their filings has been dismissed. It's not just local corruption. They have someone positioned to intercept challenges before they reach the point where a court would have to rule on them. Eliza sat back. The lamp was burning low, and she reached to adjust the wick without thinking, the automatic habit of a woman who had managed a household, and the small domestic act felt strange in the middle of what they were looking at. This changes your plan, she said. It changes some of it. If they control the review process, going to the territorial land office doesn't work. No. He was quiet for a moment. But a federal circuit court is a different matter. Federal jurisdiction overrides territorial administration. If we can get this evidence in front of a federal judge, the territorial arrangement doesn't protect them. He looked at the letters. The problem is access. Federal circuit courts aren't accessible to private citizens without going through the territorial system, which they control, or without a federal law enforcement presence, which means the marshal's office. The marshal, Eliza said carefully. Is that viable? It's complicated. He stood, moved to the window that faced out over the dark valley below. There's a deputy marshal out of the Ridgeline district named Cowboy. I've had dealings with him. He's not in Cutter's pocket, which puts him in a fairly small category of law in this territory. But he's also methodical. He doesn't move without evidence, and the evidence has to be organized in a form he can take to his supervisor without it looking like something a frontier cowboy put together in a mountain cabin. Eliza looked at the papers on the table, at her father's notebook, at the letters with Aldous Crane's signature. Then we organize it. Mercer turned from the window and looked at her with an expression that she was beginning to recognize, the slight recalibration he made when she said something that landed differently than he expected. She wondered if he had not anticipated her being useful, or if he had not anticipated her being this specific kind of useful, or if it was something else entirely. She decided she would think about that later. I can write, she said. Clearly, my father taught me. I can organize these records and the notebook entries into a documented account that follows the chronology and cites each piece of evidence with a reference. She looked at him directly. What I need to know is what format a deputy marshal needs it in, and what the weakest parts of the case currently are. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair and sat back down at the table. The weakest part is the ledger records. We have evidence of the scheme, the letters, the timeline, the pattern of acquisitions. What we don't have is the internal financial records that show the money moving between Dunmore and the parties they've paid. Without the ledgers, a good defense attorney argues that the Crane letters describe intent, but not execution. Where are the ledgers? Cutter's operation runs its books out of the building he calls his land office on the main street in Black Hollow. Second floor, back room. He met her eyes. We don't have what we need to get in there. Not yet. Not yet. She noticed the phrasing. But you have a plan, she said. I have the beginning of one. He looked at the letters on the table. Someone inside the Dunmore organization gave your father these. That person is still somewhere in this situation. If they gave documents to your father and your father wrote down everything he observed, there may be something in the notebook that narrows down who they are. Eliza looked at the notebook, 40 pages of her father's hand organized by date. She had not read it yet, had not had the chance, had not quite been ready to, for reasons she did not fully examine. I'll read it tonight, she said. He nodded. He stood, took the lamp from the table, crossed to the shelf where the extra candle stubs were kept, lit one from the lamp and set it on the table in front of her without comment. Then he took the lamp to the cot in the corner, set it on the floor, lay down with his boots on and his hat over his face, and was quiet. She opened the notebook. Her father's handwriting was so familiar it was almost unbearable. The slight backward tilt of his letters, the way he made his sevens with a crossbar, the particular way he wrote the word observed with a small circle over the E that was his own private shorthand and that she had never seen anyone else do. She sat in the candlelight and read 2 years of his careful observations while the man on the cot breathed slowly in the corner and the night settled around the cabin with all its weight. Marcus Thorne had been watching Cutter's operation long before Cutter's operation had been watching him. The notebook documented 14 property acquisitions with dates and the names of the displaced families, annotated with observations about the methods used in each case. It documented his attempts to speak with the sheriff, the land office, the county recorder. It documented the visit of a man named Perkins, who had come to the Thorne Ranch in the guise of a water survey and who had spent an unusual amount of time examining the spring locations and the creek outlet. It documented a conversation overheard at the Black Hollow General Store between two men who worked for Cutter, discussing a timeline for the high ground acquisition in terms that made Marcus Thorne write, in the margin, they mean us. And on page 31, in an entry dated 8 months before his death, Marcus Thorne wrote, visited today by a man I will call only W. He works within the organization and has become troubled by the scope of what he is party to. He has given me copies of internal correspondence which I have secured separately. He will not come forward publicly, but has agreed to confirm specific facts if circumstances permit. He is not a brave man, but he is an honest one, which in this situation may matter more. W. Eliza stared at the letter. She looked around the room as if it might offer something, though of course it offered nothing. She looked at the man on the cot, who was either asleep or very still. Mercer. A pause. Still reading. My father's contact, he called him W. Another pause. Who works for Cutter whose name starts with W? Silence for a moment. Then, from under the hat, Whitfield. Gerald Whitfield. He's Cutter's bookkeeper. The word landed in the cabin and did not dissipate. Bookkeeper. The man who kept the ledgers. She looked back at the notebook. Read the entry again. He is not a brave man, but he is an honest one. Her father had not said that as a contradiction. He had said it as a specific type of reassurance, the kind you offer when you understand that bravery and honesty are not the same quality and that in certain circumstances the second is the more reliable. If Whitfield was troubled enough to risk giving my father those letters 8 months before he died, she said, he may still be troubled. The hat came off the face. Mercer sat up and looked at her across the room. His eyes in the candlelight were the same flat gray they were in daylight, and they were wide awake. He may be more troubled now, Mercer said. Your father is dead. He knows what he's part of, and he's been living with it. He paused. The question is whether troubled is enough, whether he's at the point where he'd risk everything or whether he just wants to feel bad about it privately and not do anything. How do we find out? Carefully. He stood from the cot. We can't approach him directly. If Cutter has any suspicion that we have those letters, the first person he'd look at is Whitfield. And if Whitfield is approached by us at the same time, it connects back fast. He came to the table, looked at the notebook open in front of her. Is there anything in there about how your father made contact with him? She turned back to page 31 and read more carefully. The entry continued below the first paragraph. W. Initiated contact through an intermediary. The intermediary is the woman who operates the millinery on Creston Street, who is W's sister-in-law, and who has no knowledge of the content of the messages she has conveyed. Eliza read it aloud. Mercer sat down slowly. The millinery. That would be Agnes Pruitt's place. The name hit her like a thrown stone. Agnes Pruitt, who had taught her to read. Agnes Pruitt, who had been at her mother's funeral. Agnes Pruitt, who had been standing in the crowd that morning staring at something above and behind the auction platform, and who had not looked at Eliza's face. She didn't know what she was carrying, Eliza said. Probably not. Mercer's voice was careful. But she would know who she was carrying it for. And she's Whitfield's sister-in-law, which means she has access to him in ways that don't look like anything. Eliza thought about Agnes Pruitt. She thought about the look on Agnes's face in the crowd. Not indifferent, she realized now, not looking away the way Tom Abernethy was looking away. Agnes had been looking at something, and the quality of that look had been specific in a way Eliza hadn't processed in the moment but was processing now. Agnes had been afraid. She owes my mother a favor she never paid back, Eliza said. That's why she pulled the registration filings for me when I asked from the jailhouse. She helped you while you were in jail? Yes. Then she's not simply complicit. She's caught somewhere in the middle. He looked at the notebook. She could be the bridge to Whitfield, without it looking like anything other than an old acquaintance visiting. Eliza was quiet for a moment. The candle moved in a draft and the shadows on the walls swayed. I'd have to go back to town, she said. Yes. Cutter's going to have people watching for me. He's going to have people watching for both of us. What he won't be watching for is you walking in through the front of Agnes Pruitt's millinery to look at hat ribbon. He looked at her steadily. It depends on whether you think she'd help. Eliza thought about it properly. Not the question of whether Agnes was a good person. She had always believed she was. But the more specific question of what Agnes would do when confronted with the choice between the safety of not acting and the cost of what happened if she didn't. It was the same question the whole town had been answering all morning on that platform. The answer for most of them had been obvious, but Agnes had pulled those registration filings. She'd help, Eliza said. She'd be terrified, and she'd argue about it, and she'd probably make me promise things I'm not sure I can promise. But she'd help. Mercer looked at her for a moment with that expression she was still learning to read. Then he nodded once. He reached across the table and closed the notebook, and she let him because she was done reading it for tonight. She had what she needed from it, and she didn't think she could stand much more of her father's handwriting by candlelight. Get some sleep, Mercer said. You keep saying that. You keep still being awake. She took the candle to the back room and set it on the floor and lay down on the bunk, with her coat still on because the altitude had put a genuine chill in the air. She stared at the ceiling. Through the wall she heard him moving at the table, the quiet rustle of letters being reordered, the scratch of pencil on paper. She had come up here with nothing. A rope burn on her wrists and 2 days of jailhouse grime and the particular hollowness of a person who has run out of people to appeal to. She had come up here because there was nowhere else to go. Now she had her father's notebook and the crane letters and the name W, and the beginning of something that was not yet a plan but had the structure of one, the way a frame had the structure of a building before the walls went up. It was not safe. It was not close to safe. Cutter's men were in her family's house, and Cutter himself would be recalibrating now, figuring out why Rhett Mercer had ridden into Black Hollow and bought one girl's debt at a price that made no commercial sense. He would have people asking questions. He would be drawing conclusions. Whatever they were going to do, they needed to do it before he drew the right one. She did not sleep for a long time, but eventually she did sleep. And when she did, she dreamed about her father's handwriting and the small circle he drew over every E in the word observed, and the 40 pages of a careful man watching something terrible approach and writing it all down, because that was the only tool he had, and using it anyway. Agnes Pruitt's millinery occupied the narrow storefront between the dry goods store and the barber on Creston Street, and it smelled the way it had always smelled, of sizing and dried lavender and the particular dusty sweetness of hat ribbons stored in wooden boxes. Eliza had been in this shop 100 times as a girl. She had sat on the low stool by the window while Agnes pinned and measured and talked in the unhurried way she had, the kind of talking that covered everything and committed to nothing, the social currency of a woman who had spent 30 years making herself indispensable to a town that did not think very hard about the people it depended on. The shop was empty when Eliza walked in on a Tuesday morning, 4 days after the night at the ranch. She had ridden down from the bench alone, which had been the arrangement. Mercer's face was too well known, his presence too conspicuous, and whatever conversation was going to happen with Agnes Pruitt needed to happen between two women who had a prior relationship, not between a woman and a stranger who was currently the subject of active speculation all over Black Hollow. Agnes was behind the counter when the bell above the door rang, and she looked up with the automatic welcome expression of a shopkeeper, and then she saw who it was, and the expression went through 3 other things in rapid succession before settling into something that was not quite any of them. Eliza. Her voice was low. She glanced past Eliza at the window, at the street visible through it. "Close the door." Eliza closed it. Agnes came around the counter. She was a small woman in her late 50s, compact and deliberate in her movements, with gray-streaked hair pinned precisely and hands that were always doing something even when they had nothing to do. Right now they were smoothing the front of her apron over and over, a tell she probably didn't know she had. She looked at Eliza the way people looked at things they had been trying not to think about and were now being forced to confront directly. "You shouldn't be in town," Agnes said. "I know. Cutter has men watching the main road. He has been asking questions." She stopped smoothing her apron and pressed her hands flat against it instead. "He came in here himself 2 days ago, asked if I had heard from you." "What did you tell him?" "That I hadn't," which was true then. Agnes's eyes were sharp and unhappy. "What are you doing, girl?" Eliza had thought about how to have this conversation on the ride down. She had thought about how much to say and how to say it, and what Agnes's specific pressure points were. Not to manipulate her, but because Agnes was a woman who made decisions based on concrete information and not on appeals to conscience. And if Eliza gave her too little, she wouldn't move, and if she gave her too much, she might panic. She had to get it right. She didn't have many chances. "I need to talk to Gerald Whitfield," she said. The hands on the apron went very still. "What makes you think," Agnes said carefully, "that I have any particular access to Gerald Whitfield?" "He's your brother-in-law." "A great many people have brothers-in-law." "Agnes." Eliza held the woman's gaze. "My father trusted you. He trusted you enough to use you as a conduit without telling you what you were carrying, because he didn't want to put you in danger. He kept your name out of his records as best he could." She paused. "But I've read those records now, and I know what he was trying to build, and I know that Gerald Whitfield is the person who can either complete it or let it die with him." Agnes looked at her for a long moment. The lavender smell of the shop sat around them like something patient. Outside on Creston Street, a wagon went past, and both of them held still until the sound of it faded. "He's frightened," Agnes said finally. Her voice had changed. The shopkeeper's register was gone, and what was underneath it was quieter and more tired. "He has been frightened for 2 years. He knows what he knows, and he knows what it makes him, being part of it, and he has not been sleeping." She looked at her hands. "He tried to leave once, 6 months ago. Told Cutter he wanted to take a position in another county. Cutter told him he was welcome to leave, but that a man who left in Gerald's particular position might find the journey difficult. Cutter threatened him." Cutter made his situation clear. Agnes looked up. "Gerald is not a strong man. I don't say that unkindly. He is my late husband's brother, and I am fond of him, but he is a man who chose comfort over difficulty at every turning and now finds himself at the end of a road he didn't see he was on." She paused. "What would you want from him?" "The ledgers. Access to them, or copies of the relevant pages. The actual transaction records showing the money flow between Dunmore and the people they've paid in the territorial system." Eliza kept her voice steady. With those records and the other evidence we have, we can go to the federal circuit. Not the territorial land office, not the county, the federal court. Cutter's arrangement doesn't reach that far. We, Agnes said. Rhett Mercer and I. Agnes absorbed this. Eliza watched her processing it, the calculation she was doing, the weighing of what she knew against what she was being asked to do, the particular arithmetic of a woman who had survived 30 years in a hard town by understanding exactly what risks were worth taking and which ones would ruin you. If I arrange for you to speak with Gerald, Agnes said slowly, and Cutter finds out, he won't find out from us. You cannot promise that. No, Eliza said, I can't promise that. I can tell you that we have been careful and that we intend to stay careful. And I can tell you that if we don't do this, the Water Rights Cooperative files its claims in 2 months, and after that, it doesn't matter how careful any of us are, because there will be nothing left to protect. She held Agnes's gaze. He already controls 14 properties. Once he controls the water, he controls everything that depends on it. That includes this town. That includes this shop. Agnes looked around the shop for a moment, at the ribbon boxes and the hat forms and the window with its view of Creston Street, with the expression of someone seeing a familiar thing differently than they have before. Tonight, Agnes said, Gerald takes his supper at my house on Tuesdays. Come to the back door at 7. Come alone. Eliza came alone. Gerald Whitfield was a narrow man of about 50 who had the physical appearance of someone who had been a more substantial person at some earlier point, loose in his clothes, slack around the jaw, with the careful stillness of a man who had learned to take up as little space as possible. He was sitting at Agnes's kitchen table when Eliza came in the back, and he stood up when he saw her with the automatic politeness of someone who had been well raised, and then he sat back down because his legs did not seem entirely reliable. Miss Thorne, he said. He did not offer his hand. She sat across the table from him. Agnes stood by the stove with her arms crossed and her face set in an expression that said she was present, but was not going to guide this conversation. Eliza did not waste time. She had ridden down from the bench with a specific understanding of how much time she had before someone noticed her absence from wherever they expected her to be, and she was aware of that margin contracting with every minute. You gave my father copies of letters from Aldous Crane, she said. Internal Dunmore correspondence. He kept them. I have them. Whitfield had gone the color of old candle wax. He looked at Agnes, who looked back at him without expression. I don't know what you... Gerald. Her voice was not unkind. I know. He wrote it down. He described the person who brought him those letters as W., a man troubled by what he was party to, a man not brave but honest. I believe that is still true. I am asking you to be honest now. Silence. The stove ticked. Something outside settled in the dark, an animal or the wind, and Whitfield flinched. If Cutter knew, he said very quietly, Cutter isn't going to know until it's too late for that to matter. You can't, Gerald. She leaned forward slightly. You have been sitting in that office keeping those books for 2 years, and you have watched them take 14 ranches, and you know what the Water Rights Cooperative is for, and you have not slept properly in months. Agnes told me, you can keep doing that. You can keep doing it until Cutter finishes what he's building, and then there will be nothing left to do about it, and you will have spent the rest of your life knowing you could have stopped it and didn't. She paused. Or you can give me what you have. He was looking at his hands on the table. They were shaking slightly. Not dramatically, just the fine tremor of a man under sustained strain. The ledger records, he said. Yes. The main books are in the second-floor office. I can't get you in there. The room is locked and Cutter keeps the key. He swallowed. But I keep a secondary record. For my own... He stopped, started again. When I understood what I was recording, I started keeping a parallel set. In case. In case I ever needed... He stopped again. Where? Eliza said. My room at the boarding house. Under the loose board beneath the window. It's everything. The payments to the territorial office, the shell company transfers, the land acquisition costs, and who received what. He looked up at her. His eyes were red around the edges in a way that had nothing to do with the evening. I've been keeping it for 14 months. Every transaction. Eliza sat with that for a moment. 14 months of parallel records, kept by a frightened man who had not been brave enough to use them, but had been honest enough to maintain them. Her father's words from the notebook. He is not a brave man, but he is an honest one, which in this situation may matter more. Will you testify? She said. If it comes to a federal hearing, will you put your name on what you know? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Agnes, by the stove, shifted her weight and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a woman suppressing the urge to say something. If you can guarantee protection, he said, if there is a federal proceeding and I am a declared witness in it, Cutter can't touch me without making things worse for himself. He pressed his hands flat on the table. If you can get to that point, I'll testify. It was not an unconditional yes. It was the yes of a man hedging to the last possible moment. But it was a yes. Eliza rode back up to the bench with the arrangement in her coat. Gerald Whitfield would leave the parallel ledger records in the loose board as they were, and if and when a federal presence was established, he would surrender them directly to a marshal's officer. He would not move them before then, on the theory that the boarding house was safer than anything in transit. Eliza had agreed, though she had not loved agreeing, because transit was risk, and a frightened man making his own decisions about risk was not a thing she had the leverage to override. Mercer heard the whole thing without interrupting. He had a habit of that, of listening to a complete account before he said anything, which was either patience or strategy and was probably both. When she finished, he said, "Calloway." "The deputy marshal." "I need to get word to him, not through any channel that goes through Black Hollow. The sheriff's office here forwards everything to the county recorder's telegraph, and the county recorder is in Cutter's arrangement." He was looking at the map on the table, the one with the blue marks. "There's a federal telegraph station in Morrow Creek, 40 miles east. If I ride tonight, I can be there by morning. Cutter's men will notice you're gone." Cutter's men have been noticing things for a week and haven't moved on it yet, which means he's still figuring out what I'm doing here. He looked up from the map. That changes when Calloway arrives. Once there's a federal presence, everything accelerates. Cutter will understand what's happening and he'll try to get ahead of it. How? The most direct thing he can do is remove the people who are going to testify. He said it plainly, without inflection. "Whitfield, you." She had known this in an abstract way. Hearing it stated plainly was different from knowing it abstractly. She sat with the difference for a moment and then moved past it, because the alternative to knowing it plainly was pretending it wasn't true, and she had spent enough of the last 2 weeks discovering where pretending got you. "So we need Calloway here fast," she said, "fast and quiet. He comes in with enough presence to establish federal jurisdiction, and we have Whitfield's records and your father's notebook and the Crane letters and 2 ranchers' affidavits and a territorial clerk's copies." He looked at the map again. "It's enough. It's enough for him to move." Eliza looked at the map too, at the 14 blue marks, at the water lines, at the road east to Morrow Creek running thin across the paper. "Go tonight," she said. "I'll be back by tomorrow night. And if something happens while you're gone," he met her eyes. "Stay on the bench. Don't go back to town. If someone comes up the track who isn't me, go through the timber on the east side and down to the creek. There's a homestead at the bottom of the creek drainage, family named Osgood. Tell them Mercer sent you." He paused. "I've helped them out. They'll take you in." She nodded. He was saddling the gray within 20 minutes, and she stood on the porch in the night air and watched him go down the track into the timber, and then the dark closed behind him, and she was alone on the bench with the cabin and the dog and the view out over the valley, where Black Hollow's scattered lights made a thin constellation against the black ground. She went inside. She sat at the table with the lamp burning and the Crane letters and the notebook in front of her, and she began writing. Not a story, an account, organized by date and evidence type, cross-referencing each claim to the document or witness that supported it, structured the way she imagined a judge would want to see it structured, in language that left as little room as possible for the kind of ambiguity that defense attorneys lived inside. She was not a lawyer, she knew that, but she had been organized by a father who taught her that a clear record was its own form of protection, and she had spent 2 weeks living inside this evidence, and clarity was what she had to offer. She wrote until 3 in the morning. She went to sleep with ink on her hands, and the lamp burned down to almost nothing, and she slept without dreaming this time, which was either because she was too tired or because she had moved past the point where dreaming seemed like the relevant activity. Mercer was not back by the following night. He was not back by the morning after that. By midday of the second day, Eliza had checked the east timberline twice and told herself twice that 40 miles there and 40 miles back on terrain Mercer knew well was not the kind of journey that kept to a precise schedule, that he might have had to wait for Calloway, that the telegraph might have required time to confirm credentials, that there were ordinary explanations for the delay that did not involve the worst thing she was trying not to think about. She was starting on the third explanation when she heard horses on the track. Not one horse. At least 3. She was through the cabin and out the back in the time it took her to grab the notebook and the letters from the table, moving into the east timber the way Mercer had described, and she was 20 yards into the trees when she heard the horses stop at the cabin and the sound of men dismounting and the particular creak of a cabin door being pushed open by someone who was not knocking first. She kept moving. The timber was dense enough to cover her, and she knew the sound of the creek below, knew to move toward it, knew the drainage would lead her to the Osgood place if she followed it right. She was 100 yards in when a voice came from somewhere above and behind her, not from the cabin, from the ridge above the bench, from a position that meant they had come from 2 directions. "Miss Thorne." The voice was unhurried, carrying easily through the trees. It was the voice of a man who did not need to shout to communicate that shouting was an option. "Mr. Cutter would like to speak with you." She stopped moving. She stood in the timber with the notebook pressed against her chest under her coat and the letters folded against it, and she assessed what she had. She was on foot. She didn't know how many men were on the ridge above. The creek was still 40 yards below her through rough ground. She thought about running. She thought about what Mercer had said about Cutter's most direct option being to remove the people who were going to testify. She thought about Gerald Whitfield sitting at Agnes Pruitt's kitchen table with his hand shaking. She thought about her father writing things down in the last year of his life, because it was the only tool he had. Then she straightened her back, the same way she had straightened it on the auction platform, and she turned around and walked back toward the cabin, because the records under her coat were safer if she was alive and present and visible. And because Cutter wanting to speak with her meant Cutter did not yet know what she had, and as long as he did not know what she had, there was still time. But it was narrowing. The margin was narrowing fast. Whatever Mercer was doing in Morrow Creek, he needed to do it in a hurry, because Dale Cutter's patience had evidently reached its limit, and the next move was his, and it was already in motion. She walked out of the timber into the morning light with her head up, and her expression giving nothing away. And the 2 men waiting at the edge of the bench watched her come with the flat attention of men who had been paid to watch and not to think. And the valley below lay spread out in all directions, ordinary and indifferent, going about its business without any awareness of what was building above it. They took her to the Thorne Ranch. That was the first thing that registered. Not the rope they tied her hands with, not the 2 men flanking her on the ride down from the bench, but the specific destination. They were taking her to her father's house, which Cutter's men had been occupying for 3 weeks now, and which she had not set foot inside since the morning the debt collectors came. She thought about what that meant, the choice of location, the particular statement it made, and she filed it away because everything Cutter did was calculated, and understanding his calculations was the only advantage she currently had. The notebook and the Crane letters were still under her coat. The men who rode with her had not searched her, which was either carelessness or arrogance, or the assumption that a young woman walking out of the timber on her own represented a solved problem. She was going to let them keep thinking that for as long as possible. The ranch looked wrong from the outside. It took her a moment to identify why. The gate to the corral was hanging at an angle, off one hinge, and no one had fixed it. Her father would have fixed a gate hinge the same day it broke. Small things like that had mattered to him, not for appearances, but because small negligences compounded into large ones. And a man who let his gate hang also let his fencing go, and also let his water channels silt up. And a ranch that was not maintained was a ranch that was dying by increments. The men Cutter had put here did not care about that. It was not their land, and they knew it wasn't. And the knowledge had an effect on everything they touched. Dale Cutter was waiting on the porch. He was dressed as he had been on the auction platform. The good coat, the boots that cost more than the monthly wage of anyone who worked for him. He had a coffee cup in his hand, which he did not offer to put down, and his expression was the same expression she had been seeing on his face for 3 weeks. The expression of a man whose patience with a situation had been adequate so far but was becoming less so. "Miss Thorne," he said, "come inside." It was phrased as an invitation. It was not one. She went inside. Her father's house. The same table, the same chairs, the same stone fireplace with the iron hook her mother had hung pots on. Someone had moved the furniture slightly, pushed things out of their accustomed positions by the small amounts that accumulate when people who don't know a room live in it. The bookshelf beside the window had books on it that weren't her father's. There was a coat on the hook by the door that belonged to neither of her parents. She stood in the center of the room and looked at it all and kept her face neutral. Cutter came in behind her and closed the door. One of the men from the ridge came in with him and stood near the door with his arms at his sides. The other one stayed outside. "Sit down," Cutter said. She sat. He took the chair across the table from her, her father's chair, which she noticed and which she suspected he noticed her noticing. He set his coffee cup on the table and regarded her with that considered, unhurried attention. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been staying on a mountain bench." "You've been doing a good deal more than that." He leaned back in the chair. "You visited Agnes Pruitt's millinery 6 days ago. You spoke with Gerald Whitfield at her home 2 evenings ago." He let that land. "Gerald is an anxious man. He told me about your conversation the following morning." The cold that moved through her was brief and she controlled it. She did not look away from him. "Then you know I'm trying to understand what happened to my father's property," she said. "I know you've been speaking with Rhett Mercer, who has an old grudge against my business interests going back 3 years, and I know you retrieved something from your father's smokehouse 11 days ago, and I know you rode to Agnes Pruitt's shop, and I know you spoke with my bookkeeper." He picked up the coffee cup. "What I want to know is what specifically you think you found, and what you intend to do with it." Whitfield had told him. The thought sat in her chest like a stone. She ran back through the conversation in Agnes's kitchen, what she had said and how she had said it, what Whitfield had confirmed. The parallel ledger records, the loose board under the window at the boarding house. She kept her face neutral. "I don't know what you mean by found." "Miss Thorne." He set the cup down and his voice dropped a register, not loud, just more direct. "I have been patient with this situation out of respect for your father, who was a straightforward man even when he was inconvenient. I'm less inclined toward patience now. You went into that smokehouse at night and you came out with something, and I'd like to know what it was." "My father's tools," she said. "A few personal items." Cutter looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to the window, and stood there looking out at the corral with the broken gate. "Rhett Mercer rode east 3 days ago," he said. "Do you know where he went?" She said nothing. "The reasonable assumption," Cutter said, still looking out the window, "is Morrow Creek, the Federal Telegraph Station." He turned from the window. "Which means you've already sent for someone, and the question is whether they're coming and how quickly." He walked back to the table but did not sit. He stood looking down at her. "Here's what I want you to understand. Whatever you think you have, it is not enough. The territorial review process will not accept challenges to properly filed debt instruments without a superior court ruling, and the superior court in this territory takes its filing direction from the county recorder's office, which does not pass challenges of this nature forward." He said it the way a man explained an accounting principle. Matter of fact, neither cruel nor kind. "I have not built this position carelessly. There is no angle from which what you are doing works." "You forgot one," Eliza said. He looked at her. "Federal jurisdiction," she said. "A federal circuit court doesn't go through the territorial review process. It doesn't go through the county recorder. It doesn't go through any channel you've arranged anything in." She held his gaze. "You built a very thorough system inside the territorial structure. You didn't account for someone going around it." Something moved in Cutter's face. It was small, and it was brief, and it was the first time she had seen anything in his expression that was not the expression of a man in control of his situation. "You don't have standing to file in federal circuit," he said. "I don't. A deputy U.S. Marshal does." She paused. "Rhett Mercer knows Calvin Calloway out of the Ridgeline District. They have history." Cutter was very still. Gerald is going to tell you I described the parallel records he's been keeping, she said. I'd assume you're going to go to his room at the boarding house and look under the loose board by the window, if you haven't already. She watched his face, the slight confirmation that moved through it. But Gerald's records are copies. He's a meticulous man. There are other copies in places you don't know about, and the originals of my father's notes and the Crane letters are not currently in this room, regardless of what your men think they found in that smokehouse. This was a partial truth. The originals were under her coat. But Cutter didn't know that, and what she was doing was narrowing his options by making him uncertain about what he controlled and what he didn't. Because a man who was certain of his control made bold moves, and a man who was uncertain made cautious ones, and she needed him cautious for the next 12 hours. Cutter pulled out the chair and sat back down. He looked at her for a long time, in a silence that had a different quality than his earlier silences, more calculating, less assured. "What is it you want?" he said. "Not concession, assessment. I want my father's ranch returned. I want the 14 families you displaced given legal remedy. I want the Dunmore Syndicate's operations in this territory formally examined by a federal court." She said it evenly, without heat. Those aren't negotiating positions. That's what's going to happen. "You're very certain for someone sitting where you're sitting." "I'm sitting in my father's house," she said. "I've been certain about that part for a while." He studied her. Whatever he was calculating behind his eyes, she could not follow it completely. Cutter was better at keeping things off his face than most people she had encountered, and the partial crack she had seen a moment ago had already been repaired. He was a man who had been outmaneuvered before, probably, in smaller ways, and who had developed the habit of not showing it. "You'll stay here tonight," he said. "I'll have someone bring you supper. Not a prisoner, formally. Not free either." She understood the arrangement. He was buying time, the same as she was. He left. The man by the door remained. She sat in her father's chair at her father's table, and she thought about Calvin Calloway and 40 miles of terrain, and a man who wrote at night. She thought about Gerald Whitfield going to Cutter's office the morning after their conversation, and what specific things he had said, and what specific things he had held back. She thought about Agnes Pruitt standing at her stove with her arms crossed. She thought about Mercer on the gray horse moving east through the dark. She unfolded her hands on the table, looked at the ink that was still faintly visible along the inside of her right index finger from the writing she had done 2 nights ago. The account she had written was folded with the letters inside her coat. It was meticulous. It was organized. It cited every piece of evidence to its source. If Calloway came, and if he came with sufficient authority to establish jurisdiction, what she had under her coat was the foundation of a federal case. If he didn't come, or didn't come fast enough, she was sitting in her father's house with a man by the door and Dale Cutter somewhere on the property doing his own calculations, and the margin was very thin. She had told Cutter she was certain. She was not certain. She was committed, which was a different thing. And she was beginning to understand that the difference between the two was exactly what this whole situation had always been about. The supper they brought was salt pork and cornbread, which she ate because not eating was foolish, and she needed to think clearly. The man by the door ate standing up and did not speak to her. Outside the window the light failed and the valley went dark, and the stars came out in their indifferent abundance. At 10 o'clock the man by the door was replaced by another one, younger, with the expression of someone who had drawn an undesirable assignment. At 11 she asked for water, and he brought it. At midnight she put her head down on the table and slept for 2 hours, lightly, the way you slept when you knew you needed to be ready to wake up. She was awake again at 2, sitting upright in the dark room with only the low light from the fireplace, when she heard the first horse on the road outside. Then more than one horse. She stood. The man by the door had stood too, his hand moving toward the weapon at his hip with the automatic reflex of someone surprised out of drowsiness. Outside, voices. Then louder voices. Then a sound she had not been expecting. The sound of Dale Cutter's voice, and it had lost, for the first time since she had known him, all of its careful modulation. She moved to the window. In the thin light from the ranch house and the moon that had risen since midnight, she could see the road in front of the property and what was on it. 3 riders had come from the east. 2 of them wore the badges that caught the moonlight in the particular way of federal authority. The third was Rhett Mercer on the gray horse, and he was already dismounting with the ease of a man who had been riding for 2 days and had arrived exactly where he intended to arrive. Cutter was on the porch. He had come out of whatever room he'd been in, and he was on the porch looking at the three riders, and his face was, for once, entirely unguarded. Not afraid exactly, but working through something rapidly, the assessment of a man who had spent years ensuring that this specific configuration could not arrive and was now standing in front of it. Calvin Calloway swung down from his horse. He was a broad man of about 50, deliberately unhurried, wearing a canvas coat over his badge, and carrying himself with the specific gravity of someone who had spent a career arriving at places where his presence was unwelcome. He looked at Cutter on the porch, and he pulled a folded document from his coat. "Dale Cutter," he said. His voice carried easily in the night air. "Federal warrant for seizure of business records and temporary injunction against land title transfers pending investigation by the 8th Circuit Court of the Territory. Issued this morning from the Morrow Creek Federal Office on the application of Deputy Marshal Calvin Calloway, Ridgeline District." He held it out. "You can read it yourself, or I can summarize it for you." Cutter did not take the document. He stood on the porch and looked at it, and then he looked at Mercer, who was standing at the edge of the lamplight with an expression that was not triumphant, just present, just finished with something he had been working on for a long time. The man by the door in the main room had moved to look out the window beside Eliza, and she used the moment of his distraction to cross to the door, open it, and walk out onto the porch. Cutter saw her. He looked at her standing on her father's porch under the night sky, and some last calculation completed itself behind his eyes. The question of what she had and hadn't been carrying. The question of what Mercer had and hadn't gotten to Calloway before the warrant was issued. The question of what a federal investigation would and would not turn up. "Miss Thorne," Calloway had seen her too. "Are you the individual who assembled the documentary record submitted in support of this application?" "I am," she said. He nodded once, the nod of a man confirming something he already knew. "We're going to need to speak with you at length, tonight, if you're able." "I'm able," she said. Cutter had not moved from the porch. He was a man who had made every decision in his professional life from a position of structural advantage, from inside a system he had spent years arranging to support him. And he was standing now at the moment where that system had been gone around, and he was working out, with the visible effort of a man doing something genuinely difficult, how to adjust. "I'll want my attorney present for any—" he started. "You're welcome to contact your attorney," Calloway said. "The warrant is not contingent on your cooperation. We'll be executing a search of the land office on the main street in Black Hollow at first light, and we'll be serving notice to the Dunmore Syndicate's registered agents in the county seat by telegraph before that." He folded the document and returned it to his coat. "If you have something you'd like to say to me before that happens, now would be the time." Cutter said nothing. He looked at Eliza one more time, and she looked back at him. And whatever he was looking for in her face he did not find, because there was nothing in her face for him to find except the same expression she had worn on the auction platform. Not defiant, not triumphant, just present and clear-eyed and entirely unwilling to look somewhere else. He went inside. Mercer came up the porch steps. He looked like a man who had been on a horse for 2 days, which he had been, dusty and stiff around the jaw, and moving with the particular economy of someone running on determination more than energy. He looked at her, and she looked at him. "You're here," he said. "Where else would I be? When I saw Cutter's men on the bench trail, I walked out to meet them," she said. "It seemed like the right call." He was quiet for a moment. "The account you wrote." Calloway said it was the clearest documentation he'd received in 12 years of federal work. She absorbed that without comment, which seemed to be what he expected because he didn't add to it. Behind them, Calloway was organizing his men, directing one back toward town to secure the telegraph line and keep word from reaching the county seat before the federal message did. The night was cold and bright, and the broken corral gate hung at its angle in the moonlight. "The gate hinge is off," Eliza said. Mercer looked at the corral. "I'll fix it tomorrow." "I'll fix it myself," she said. "It's my gate." He looked at her. The lines in his face in the moonlight were the same lines they had been by lamplight in the cabin. The same wear, the same steadiness. He had ridden 40 miles and turned around and ridden back. and he was still standing upright on her father's porch, and she thought that whatever he was, complicated and difficult and not easy to know, he was a man who had kept his word about every specific thing he had said he would do. That was not nothing. On the frontier, as she had spent 18 years learning, it was not nothing at all. Inside the house, Calloway's voice was steady and official, beginning the machinery of a federal investigation with the methodical patience of a man who did this for a living. Outside, Black Hollow was still mostly asleep, not yet aware that the morning would bring something it had not seen coming, that the structure it had lived inside for 3 years, the structure it had been afraid of and accommodating of and complicit with, was going to be taken apart board by board in the daylight, with warrants and witnesses, and the particular finality of a system that had not yet been purchased, being brought to bear on the one that had. Eliza stood on her father's porch and looked out at the valley and felt the cold air coming down from the high country. She was tired in a way that went into the bone. Her wrists still had the marks from the rope. She had not slept in a real bed in 2 weeks. And the house behind her, her father's house, was currently occupied by federal officers and the remains of Dale Cutter's operation, and it would be a while yet before it was simply hers again. But the gate was still her gate. The springs were still her springs. The cottonwood windbreak her father had planted was still standing in the dark, 30 feet tall, making it sound like moving water whenever the wind was up. She was still here. She had not left. And in the morning, when Black Hollow woke up and looked at what had happened in the night, it would have to find some way to account for the fact that the girl it had watched in silence from the boardwalks had not in fact been finished. The federal investigation took 11 weeks. Eliza knew this because she counted them, not obsessively, not marking a wall the way prisoners did in stories, but in the practical way of a woman managing a working ranch who needed to know how many weeks the corral fence had gone without proper maintenance, and how many weeks the south pasture had been ungrazed, and how many weeks it had been since anyone had checked the creek outlet for silting. Time on a ranch was not abstract. It was the distance between what something was and what it needed to become, measured in the only unit that mattered, which was the work that fit inside it. She fixed the gate hinge the morning after Calloway arrived. It took 20 minutes and a hammer and a new pin from the toolbox in the barn, which Cutter's men had not touched, probably because they had no use for tools. She rehung the gate, tested the swing, and went back inside to make coffee for the federal officers who were currently occupying her kitchen table with their paperwork. It was not a graceful reoccupation of her own home. That was the honest truth of it. Calloway's men were professional and not unkind, but there were 4 of them at various points during the first week, and they ate a great deal and left their gear in rooms they had not been invited to use. And the process of establishing federal jurisdiction over a contested property while simultaneously conducting an active investigation out of that same property was, in practice, loud and disorganized, and frequently interrupted by riders arriving with documents or messages that needed immediate attention. Mercer stayed 3 days. He gave his formal statement to Calloway on the second day. 3 hours in the front room with a federal recorder present, laying out 3 years of observation and evidence collection in the organized, precise way of a man who had been preparing for exactly this accounting. When he was done, he came out and drank coffee, standing at the kitchen window without talking, which Eliza had learned was how he processed things that had taken significant effort. "That's the 3rd time you've been through that," she said. She meant the 3 years, the accounting of it. "It's the first time it went somewhere," he said. On the 3rd day, he told her he was riding out to speak with the 2 ranchers who had given affidavits, the Hanley family and the Corbridge brothers, to let them know the investigation was formal and federal and that their testimony would be required in an organized capacity. He said it the way he said most things, without ceremony, and he saddled the gray and rode out in the early morning before the heat had built. He did not say when he would be back. She did not ask. She had other things to attend to. The first thing was Gerald Whitfield. Calloway had gone to the boarding house and retrieved the parallel ledger records from under the loose board on the same night he arrived. Whitfield had been present for this, pale and silent, watching the federal officer handle the records he had kept for 14 months, with the expression of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and was only now being permitted to set it down. When Calloway told him he was a declared federal witness with the protections attendant to that status, Whitfield sat down on his bed and put his face in his hands for a moment that Calloway described when he relayed the account to Eliza as one of the more complicated things he had witnessed in his career. "He's not a bad man," Eliza said. "No," Calloway agreed. "He's a man who made a series of small decisions that added up to a large one, and then spent 2 years understanding what the large one was." He looked at her. "There are a lot of those. They're not the easiest kind to know what to do with." Eliza thought about the 14 families, about the Hanley Ranch and the Corbridge claims, and the 12 others whose land had been taken through the same mechanism that had been used on her father. What happens to the properties? If the circuit court rules in favor of the federal complaint, and with Whitfield's records and your documentation and the Crane letters, I expect it will, the fraudulent debt instruments are voided. The title transfers executed under those instruments are reversed. Calloway paused. "It is not instantaneous. Courts are not instantaneous. But the injunction I've filed prevents any further transfers and freezes the Dunmore Syndicate's territorial assets while the case proceeds. Nothing moves until the court says so." "How long?" "For a matter this complex, involving this many properties and this many parties, 6 months to a year before a final ruling." He looked at her steadily. "I know that's not what you wanted to hear." It wasn't. But she had spent long enough in this situation to understand that wanting things to move faster than they moved was a form of magical thinking, and magical thinking was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She had a ranch to run. That was the other thing. The Thorne Ranch, without her father, and without the resources he had built over 20 years, was in worse shape than the gate hinge had suggested. Cutter's men had not been deliberately destructive, but 3 weeks of occupancy by people who had no investment in the place had let a dozen small things go that her father would never have allowed to go. And a ranch was a system in which small things communicated with each other. A silted creek outlet affected the south pasture water. An unrepaired section of fencing affected where the cattle ranged. Cattle that ranged incorrectly affected what was available for winter feed. She went through the property methodically in the first week, the way her father had taught her, and she made a list. The list was long. She could not afford hired hands. She had $12 in cash, which was what remained after 2 weeks of eating on Mercer's supplies, and the small amount she had managed to retrieve from the house before the debt collectors came. She had the property, if the injunction held, and she had the cattle that remained after Cutter's men had sold off what they considered surplus. And she had the tools in the barn and the seeds in the seed store and the knowledge her father had spent 18 years transferring to her by doing things alongside her and expecting her to pay attention. She paid attention now. Agnes Pruitt came out the second week. She arrived in her small wagon on a Tuesday morning and unloaded 2 crates of preserved food from the back with the efficiency of a woman who had made a decision and was implementing it without requiring anyone's approval. She set the crates on the porch and looked at Eliza and said, "Gerald told me he gave you up to Cutter." "He did," Eliza said. "He told me himself. He came to my house and told me directly, which I didn't expect." Agnes pressed her lips together. "He said he was frightened, and it came out of him before he thought about it. And he told Cutter just enough to confirm that you existed as a threat without telling him about the parallel records, which was either calculation or incomplete panic, and he wasn't sure himself which one." Eliza considered this. Whitfield had told Cutter about her conversation with him, but had not revealed the existence of his own records. She had wondered about that gap. He protected himself by protecting the evidence. Or he protected the evidence because protecting himself required it. Agnes set down the second crate. "Either way, here we are." "Here we are," Eliza agreed. Agnes stayed 4 hours, which was longer than she had announced, and they worked together on the south fence line in companionable silence that was occasionally punctuated by Agnes saying something direct about the state of the posts or the quality of the wire, and Eliza responding in kind. It was not the same as what it had been when Eliza was a girl sitting on the stool in the millinery shop, but it was something that had the same root in it. 2 people who had known each other a long time, doing a thing that needed doing, without requiring it to be more than that. Before she left, Agnes said, "Tom Abernethy asked about you." Eliza kept her eyes on the fence post she was tamping. "What did he say?" "He asked if you needed help with the ranch." Agnes's voice was neutral, relaying the information without editorializing. I told him I didn't know and that he ought to ask you directly. Tom Abernethy, who had studied his boots on the auction platform. Tom Abernethy, who had helped her father mend fence 2 summers ago and who had looked at the ground while she stood up there with her hands tied. She kept tamping the post. Tell him he can ask me himself. He came the following Saturday. He was a lean man in his early 40s with a burned red face and the particular manner of someone who knows he has done a thing he is not proud of and has not yet decided how to address it. He stood at the gate she had fixed, swinging properly on its hinge, and he held his hat in both hands. Miss Thorne, he said. She was mending wire 20 feet away. She did not put it down. Abernethy. He was quiet for a moment. I came to see if you needed— Why? She said. He blinked. Ma'am? Why now? She looked at him directly. You were there. You were standing 20 feet from that platform, and you knew my father, and you knew those papers were fraudulent, and you looked at your boots. The words landed the way she had intended them to, which was plainly and without elaboration. She was not interested in making him feel worse than he already felt. She was interested in whether he would answer honestly. He was quiet for a long moment. He turned his hat in his hands. I have a wife, he said, and 3 children, and I have 40 acres that I can barely hold on to in a good year. He met her eyes. I told myself there was nothing I could do. And maybe there wasn't specifically. But what I actually was scared. And I told myself a story about it being helplessness, so I didn't have to look at the scared part. It was a more honest answer than she had expected. She stood there with the wire in her hands and looked at him and thought about her father, who had trusted people the way you trusted a tool. You learned what they were made of, and you used them for what they were made for, and you did not blame a claw hammer for not being a drill. I need the south fence completely redone, she said. The creek outlet cleared, 2 sections of the barn roof reshingled. She paused. I can't pay you until after the court rules and I know what I have. I'm not asking to be paid, he said. I know. She looked at him. I'm telling you I intend to pay you. That's different. He nodded. He put his hat back on. I'll bring my boy on Monday. He did bring his boy on Monday, and on Wednesday he brought Will Draper, the young man who had been looking at his hands on the auction platform, who arrived with his own tools and worked without speaking much and worked hard. And on Thursday, a woman named Cecilia Corbridge, whose family's land claim was among the 14 being reviewed by the federal court, rode over from the neighboring property and spent the day helping Eliza clear the creek outlet. And while they worked, Cecilia talked about her children and her cattle and the specific texture of 3 years of fear in a way that was not complaining, but was simply the accurate accounting of what it had been like to live inside it. Black Hollow was not transformed overnight. That was not how towns worked, and it was not how people worked. The sheriff remained the sheriff, though Calloway had made clear to him in terms that left no ambiguity that his arrangement with Cutter's operation was known and was part of the federal record, and that his continuation in office was contingent on a sustained period of unremarkable behavior. Harlan Bishop at the land office was replaced by a federal appointee while the investigation was active, which caused considerable discussion in town and no resolution. The saloon went on doing what saloons did. The boardwalks went on being walked. But there were things that had changed that did not unchange. People said hello to Eliza Thorne when she came to town for supplies. That was the first thing, small and specific. They said it the way you said hello to a person you had been wrong about and knew it and did not have the language to address directly, so you said hello with a particular quality of eye contact that carried the weight of the thing that was not being said. She accepted it for what it was, which was as far as most of them were able to go, and she did not require it to be more. Agnes Pruitt said something direct, which was more characteristic. You make people uncomfortable, she told Eliza one afternoon in the millinery, with the satisfaction of someone reporting a natural phenomenon. Not because of what you did, because of what they didn't do. Those are different kinds of uncomfortable, and the second one doesn't go away easy. I'm not trying to make anyone uncomfortable, Eliza said. I know, Agnes said. That's why it works. The circuit court ruling came in the 7th month. Eliza was mending tack in the barn when Calloway's deputy rode out with the document and she sat on a hay bale and read it in the afternoon light that came through the open barn door. And the legal language was dense and specific and took her several minutes to work through. But what it said, at its core, was this: all 14 property acquisitions executed by the Dunmore Land Syndicate through Consolidated Western Finance and its affiliated entities were void. All associated title transfers were reversed. The Dunmore Syndicate's territorial assets were seized in partial satisfaction of the federal judgment. Aldous Crane and 2 other named principals faced criminal referral. Dale Cutter faced criminal referral. Gerald Whitfield, in recognition of his cooperation with federal investigators, was extended a conditional immunity contingent on his testimony at the criminal proceedings. The Thorn Ranch was hers. She sat with it for a while. The barn smelled of hay and horses and old leather and the particular dust that barns accumulated, and that was different from the dust outside, older, more settled, more inhabited. One of the mares put her head over the stall door and regarded Eliza with the patience and curiosity of horses. The light through the door moved as a cloud crossed the sun and then moved back. She folded the document and went to find Mercer. He had come back 6 weeks after he left, which had not surprised her. He had not said when he was coming back, and she had not asked. And a man who had been doing something for 3 years did not simply stop when the official part of it concluded. He had things to settle. She understood that. And she had things to settle. And the question of what came after the settling was one she had been keeping at a certain distance. He was at the corral, working with one of the younger horses. Not breaking it, nothing so dramatic, just standing in the enclosure with it, moving when it moved, holding still when it needed stillness. The patient language of a man who knew how to wait for something without forcing it. She had watched him do this before. It was different from the stillness he used in the cabin or the stillness on horseback. It was more present somehow, less contained, as if the horse required him to be actually there rather than operationally there. She held the folded document over the corral rail. He came to it without hurrying the horse, took it, read it again. 14 families, he said. 14, she agreed. He handed the document back. He looked at the young horse, which had come up behind him with the tentative boldness of a young animal testing what it was allowed to do. He did not look at Eliza immediately, and she had known him long enough by now to understand that this was not avoidance. It was how he processed things that mattered, by putting his eyes somewhere uncomplicated while his mind did the complicated part. 3 years, she said. It was 12 the last time I counted, he said. She looked at him. He was still watching the horse. She thought about the map with the blue marks and the crane letters, and the 2 days he had spent on a horse to get to a telegraph station and back, and the specific quality of his face on her father's porch in the moonlight, when he had said, "Where else would I be?" And she thought about all the things that had happened in the last 4 months that they had not talked about, because there had always been something more immediate to attend to. "What do you do now?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. The young horse pushed at his shoulder with her nose, testing this too, and he put his hand up to steady her without looking at her. "I don't know yet," he said. "It's been a long time since I didn't have a specific thing to do." He paused. "What about you?" She looked at the ranch, at the gate on its fixed hinge, the barn with its new shingles on the south section of roof, the creek running clean through the outlet they had cleared, the cottonwoods her father had planted standing in the afternoon light. There were things still broken. There were things that would take years. The south pasture needed reseeding, and the equipment was older than it should be, and she had 12 head of cattle where her father had run 40. And building back from 12 was the work of several years of careful decisions. She knew how to make careful decisions. She had been learning that her whole life, from a man who wrote things down because it was the only tool he had, and who had turned out to be right that documentation was a form of power, that the truth written down clearly enough and kept safe long enough could outlast the people trying to bury it. "I have a ranch to run," she said. He looked at her then, directly, the way he did when he had finished processing. "You need more hands." "I do. I know some men who are looking for legitimate work." He let that settle for a moment. "Men who can be trusted, which is the relevant quality." "The relevant quality," she agreed. The horse had settled into the warm circle of his presence with the ease of something that had made up its mind. Eliza stood at the rail with the federal ruling in her hand and the light on the cottonwoods and the sound of the creek she could hear from here when it was quiet enough, which it was now. There were things they did not say. There were things between them that had been building for 4 months in the particular way that things built between people who were too occupied with survival to address them directly. And those things would be addressed in time, or they wouldn't. And either way, the ranch still needed to be run, and the cattle still needed tending, and the south fence still needed the final section redone, and the world continued on its actual axis, which was not love or justice, or even truth, but simply work. The ongoing, ordinary human transaction with what was in front of you and what needed doing. But the land was hers. That was the foundation of everything else. The land that her father had worked and protected and documented with a meticulous love that Eliza had not fully understood until she found his notebook by candlelight and read 2 years of his careful watching and understood for the first time how much he had known and how deliberately he had prepared the ground for someone who came after. She had come after. She was still here. Black Hollow would not become a different town because of what had happened. Towns did not work that way. The fear that had made people look at the ground and study their boots, that fear did not vanish because its immediate cause was removed. It went dormant the way certain things went dormant, and it would come back when the conditions for it returned, because that was the nature of the thing. But something else had also been established, and it would not go dormant as easily. 14 families who had lost their land were getting it back. A federal record existed that documented exactly how it had been taken and exactly who had taken it, and that record did not disappear when the case closed. Gerald Whitfield had put his name on what he knew, and that name was in the permanent record of the federal court. And the specific transactions he had recorded were cited and indexed and cross-referenced. And anyone who tried to do what the Dunmore Syndicate had done in this territory would find, if they looked, that it had been done before and documented, and that documentation was a thing that persisted. Eliza's father had understood this. He had written things down in a cramped, careful hand with a small circle over every E in the word observed, and he had hidden what he'd written in a false bottom under a salting shelf in a smokehouse on a piece of land that people were trying to take from him, and he had died before he could use it. But she had used it. She had taken what he left and added to it and carried it 40 miles in the dark under her coat and put it in front of a federal officer in language organized clearly enough that Calloway had described it as the best documentation he had received in 12 years of federal work. She was 18 years old. She had been sold at auction on a wooden platform in the center of town, and nobody had looked at her face. She looked out at this ranch now, at all of it, at the full sweep of it in the afternoon light. The grass and the timber and the springs and the creek and the cottonwoods and the cattle moving slow in the south pasture and the mountains rising behind all of it with their indifferent blue permanence. And she thought about what it meant to rebuild something from what was left after the worst had already happened. It meant starting where you were. It meant using what you had. It meant understanding that the people who helped you were not obligated to, and that the people who hadn't were afraid. And that fear was a fact of human life, and not a final verdict on anyone. It meant the work in front of you was still the work in front of you regardless of everything else that had happened, and you either did it or you didn't. And she had always been the kind of person who did it. Her father had been that kind of person. She had gotten it from him. "Come to supper," she said to Mercer. Not an invitation exactly, more like the natural conclusion of what the afternoon had been moving toward. He looked at the horse, gave her a final pat on the neck that was somehow both dismissal and affection, and came to the rail. "What are you making?" "Salt pork and cornbread," she said. "It's what I have." "I know how to make biscuits," he said. She looked at him. "I thought you said you were a poor cook." "I said I was a poor cook. I didn't say I couldn't make biscuits. Those are different things." She opened the gate for him. He came through it, and she latched it behind him, and they walked back toward the house in the late afternoon light, and the mountains held their position behind everything the way they always did, unchanged by any of it, patient in the way that mountains were patient, which was not kindness and not indifference, but simply the long view. The view from high enough up that the distances between things looked smaller than they felt from inside them. The girl who had stood on that platform was still standing. The land was still here. The work was still the work. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.